He bought a girl for $20. Then her next question shattered the mountain man. The mountain man lived in a world most people had forgotten. Far away from bustling towns and noisy roads, his cabin stood among tall pines and rocky hills. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine needles, and the only sounds were birds, distant streams, and the occasional rustle of deer through the underbrush. Life here was harsh, but the mountain man was even harsher. Years of surviving in the wild had shaped him into a strong, rugged man. His hands were rough, calloused from chopping wood and climbing cliffs. His face was weathered, his eyes sharp and always watchful. He had learned to trust the land more than people, and most visitors feared him because of his reputation. People in the nearby villages whispered stories about him. They said he could live through storms that would kill others, that he could hunt a deer with nothing but his hands, and that he never spoke unless he had to. Some called him cruel, others called him wise, but everyone agreed on one thing: he was alone, and he wanted it that way. Yet beneath his rough exterior, there was a loneliness he didn't often admit. It hid behind his long beard and the hard lines of his face, but it was there. Sometimes, when the night was quiet and the fire crackled in his cabin, he would feel it. The emptiness that came from having no one to share his life with, no one to laugh with, no one to care about. His days were simple and repetitive, yet filled with constant work. He woke at sunrise, chopped wood for the fire, and repaired anything that needed fixing in and around the cabin. He hunted for food, fished in the streams, and tended to his small garden, growing potatoes, beans, and whatever vegetables could survive the harsh mountain weather. The mountain man's life was one of discipline. Every task mattered, every decision could mean survival or failure. And while most would see this life as lonely, he found comfort in the rhythm of nature. The mountains were his home, and the trees, rocks, and animals were his companions. Despite his solitary life, the mountain man was not without curiosity about the world beyond the hills. Sometimes he would watch smoke rising from the village chimneys in the distance, and wonder what life was like for those who never had to worry about hunting or chopping wood. He would imagine children running through streets, women carrying baskets of bread, and men sitting around tables, talking and laughing. But those thoughts were fleeting. He would shake his head, telling himself that he didn't need them. The mountains were enough, the forest was enough, and he was enough. But that feeling of being enough often clashed with a growing sense of emptiness inside. It was subtle at first, a twinge when he saw families in the village, a pang when he noticed someone smiling with a friend. Over the years, that emptiness had grown. It wasn't loud or unbearable, but it was always there, a quiet companion. And the longer he lived alone, the louder it seemed to become. He tried to ignore it, burying himself in work, hunting trips, and long walks through the forest, but the truth was clear: he missed connection. He missed having someone who depended on him or someone he could care for without fear of being judged. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, the mountain man sat outside his cabin, sharpening his tools. His mind wandered as he listened to the wind rustling through the trees. Then, from the village below, he overheard whispers, rumors that made him pause. The villagers spoke of a young girl who was in trouble, someone who had no one to protect her, someone vulnerable and overlooked. Most people ignored her or turned away, too busy with their own lives. But the mountain man's ears pricked up. There was something in the way the villagers spoke of her, a hint of desperation that caught his attention. He found himself thinking about her more than he wanted to admit. He didn't know her name, her age, or even her story, but the idea of someone so fragile being treated unfairly struck a chord deep inside him. For a man who had spent decades isolating himself, it was unusual to feel such concern for another human being. But this concern was different from the fleeting pity he sometimes felt for stray animals or injured birds. This was stronger, heavier, and it made him feel something he hadn't in years: responsibility. Over the next few days, he made a decision. He would find the girl. Not because he wanted to control her or use her for his own gain, but because he felt that instinctive drive to protect someone weaker than himself. It was confusing, even to him, because he had spent so long thinking of survival as a solitary endeavor. People were complicated, fragile, and unpredictable, but still, he could not ignore the thought. There was a spark of something unfamiliar in him, something that told him that meeting this girl could change his life. Finally, one early morning, the mountain man set off toward the village. His path took him through narrow trails lined with moss-covered rocks, over streams with water so clear he could see the stones beneath, and past ancient trees that had watched over the land for centuries. Every step reminded him of his own life, how long he had wandered alone, and how much he had learned to rely only on himself. But this journey was different. This time, he carried hope, not just for survival but for something deeper, something meaningful. When he reached the village, he kept to the shadows, careful not to draw attention. He watched people go about their day, noticing the way some looked away when they saw him, and how others whispered behind their hands. Then he saw her. She was young, thin, and small, with eyes that seemed older than her years. Her clothes were worn, and she moved with a cautious grace, aware of every person around her. She was silent, but her presence spoke volumes. The mountain man felt an unexpected pang in his chest. She was real and vulnerable, and she reminded him of a time long ago when innocence and fear had mingled in a way he couldn't forget. He waited, observing her and the people near her. The village was busy, and few noticed her presence, but he did. For the first time in a long while, he felt a mixture of anticipation and fear. He knew that approaching her would not be easy. She might not trust him, and he might not know how to help, but still, he could not turn away. There was a pull, a silent demand in his heart that told him he had to try. And so, the mountain man took a deep breath, bracing himself for the steps that would change both their lives forever. As night fell over the village, he returned to his cabin without having approached her yet. But the thought of her stayed with him, lingering like a shadow that refused to leave. He realized that this girl, in her quiet vulnerability, had awakened something in him. He felt a strange mix of fear, curiosity, and a strange, unfamiliar hope. For the first time in decades, he considered the possibility that life could be more than survival. Life could include connection, care, and perhaps even redemption. And so, the mountain man prepared for what was to come. He sharpened his knives, packed extra provisions, and mapped a careful plan to meet the girl. But deep inside, he knew that no amount of planning could prepare him for what would happen once they met. Something told him that this encounter would not only challenge the way he lived, but also test the very foundation of who he thought he was. The mountains had made him strong, the forest had taught him patience, and the wind had whispered secrets of survival. But nothing had prepared him for the lesson he was about to learn from a small, quiet girl who had no idea how much power she held over him. And in the quiet of that night, as the stars shone over the rugged peaks, the mountain man finally admitted to himself something he had never allowed before. He was no longer just a solitary survivor. He was a man who, for the first time in his long, isolated life, felt that he might need someone else, and perhaps she might need him too. The mountain man left his cabin early the next morning. The sky was pale and misty, with the first rays of sunlight brushing the tops of the pine trees. The cold mountain air stung his face, but he welcomed it. It made him feel alive, alert, and ready for the encounter he had been planning. Today, he would find the girl. Today, he would act. The village was quieter than the day before. Most people were busy with their own chores, unaware of the mountain man's presence. He moved carefully through the narrow streets, keeping to the shadows, his eyes fixed on the girl. She was not far from where he had seen her last. She moved slowly, picking her steps carefully, her eyes scanning the people around her. There was a wariness in her movements, a careful caution that told him she had learned to be careful with strangers. He stopped behind a wall and watched her for several minutes. The village was small, and the people who noticed him quickly averted their gaze. They had heard of him, the mountain man who lived in the hills, and they respected and feared his reputation. Still, he did not come here to cause trouble. His purpose was clear, though it was complicated. He had made a decision the night before, a decision that, even now, left him uneasy. He would help her in the only way he knew how, though he wasn't entirely sure what the consequences would be. As he approached her, the girl froze. Her eyes widened slightly, and she took a careful step back. She had seen him before, but never this close. Her body tensed, and he could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. It was a natural reaction. He did not blame her. Fear was instinct, and instinct was often wise. But he did not move aggressively. He lowered his hands, showing her he meant no immediate harm. "Are you alone?" he asked in a low voice, careful not to startle her. The girl did not answer at once. She looked around as if searching for help, but there was none. The villagers were busy, unaware of the moment unfolding in the shadows of the street. Finally she whispered, I have nowhere to go." That statement, so simple and honest, struck him. It was a reminder of the world beyond the mountains, a world where children could be left without care, where life could be harsh and cruel. He felt an odd mix of emotions, pity, responsibility, and a faint trace of anger at those who had failed her. He spoke carefully. "You need to come with me. I can take care of you." The girl hesitated. "Take care of me?" she asked, her voice uncertain, wary. "Yes," he said, his tone firm but calm. "I can keep you safe. You don't have to be afraid anymore." There was a pause. She studied him, looking at his rugged face, his rough hands, and the way he stood, strong and steady. He seemed different from anyone she had seen before. There was something in his eyes that told her he had lived a hard life, and that he was used to surviving alone. He was not cruel, but he was not gentle either. He was honest. The conversation was interrupted by the village man who had been taking care of the girl until now. The man was older, with worn clothes and a rough voice. He had no real care for the girl beyond what she could earn. Seeing the mountain man approach, he became tense. "That girl belongs to me for now," the man said. "If you want her, you'll have to pay." The mountain man studied him silently. He had not expected a fight, and he did not want one. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few crumpled bills, roughly $20. It was not much, but it was all he had on him at the moment. He handed it over. The exchange was simple, almost mechanical, yet it carried a weight neither of them could deny. The mountain man now had the girl in his care, but this was not a moment of triumph. It was quiet, tense, and filled with the knowledge that life had just shifted for both of them in a way that could not be undone. The girl did not speak as she followed him. Her eyes were wide, her body tense, and her mind racing. She did not know him, had never seen this side of the world, and yet she had no choice but to follow. Every step toward the mountains was a step into uncertainty. Every step was a test of trust that she had not yet given. The journey back to his cabin was slow. They moved through narrow trails lined with rocks and trees, over streams with icy water, and across uneven ground that made travel difficult. The mountain man walked steadily, careful not to rush her, careful not to scare her further. He was not cruel, but he was unaccustomed to caring for another person in this way. Every movement required thought, every decision weighed heavily on him. Along the way, he tried to speak, to break the silence. "You'll be safe now," he said, trying to sound reassuring. The girl did not respond immediately. Then, after a long pause, she asked softly, "Why did you buy me?" The question struck him like a stone. He had expected fear, hesitation, even anger, but not a question like that. It was simple, honest, and full of meaning. It forced him to confront his own actions, to consider the morality of what he had done. He had acted out of a desire to protect, yet the reality of the situation weighed on him. I wanted to make sure you were safe," he said, his voice quiet. "I thought this was the only way." She looked at him, studying his face, and for the first time she did not seem afraid. There was a flicker of understanding, though it was mixed with confusion. "But am I yours now?" she asked. He stopped walking, kneeling by the side of the trail. "No," he said firmly. "You are not mine, you are free, but I will help you because it is the right thing to do." For a moment she stared at him, her eyes wide and thoughtful. Then slowly she nodded. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. She had understood his words, even if she did not fully trust them yet. As they continued through the forest, he began to notice small things about her. The way she walked carefully over rocks, the way her eyes observed everything, the way she held herself as though preparing for danger. She was quiet, but she had a strength of her own. It was subtle, but it was there. And for the mountain man who had lived decades alone, it was both surprising and comforting. By the time they reached his cabin, the sun was low in the sky, painting the mountains with gold and orange. The cabin seemed even more isolated now, surrounded by trees and shadows. The girl paused at the edge of the clearing, looking at the small structure with a mix of curiosity and fear. The mountain man opened the door and stepped aside. "Come in," he said. "You will be safe here tonight." She stepped inside slowly, her eyes scanning the cabin. It was simple, filled with basic furniture and tools, but clean and organized. There was a fire already burning in the stove, and the smell of cooked meat lingered in the air. She relaxed slightly, though tension still lingered in her posture. For the first time, they were in the same space, alone, and the reality of the situation began to sink in. The mountain man had never taken care of anyone like this. He was used to surviving, but not to guiding another human being. The girl had never been in a place like this before, and every sound, every smell, every shadow was new and unfamiliar. That night, as the fire crackled and the mountains outside grew dark, neither of them spoke much. He sat near the fire, sharpening his tools while she sat quietly, her eyes reflecting the flames. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken questions, fears, and possibilities. Yet in that silence, a strange understanding began to grow. They were both alone, both wary, both uncertain, but they were together in that moment. And in the quiet of the cabin, as the night deepened and the stars shone above the mountains, the mountain man realized something he had not expected. This girl, small and seemingly fragile, had already begun to teach him something important. She had reminded him of the value of human connection, of care, and of trust. She had asked a simple question, innocent, honest, and direct, that made him stop and think about the choices he had made and the responsibility he now carried. The night passed slowly. The girl eventually fell asleep near the fire, while the mountain man stayed awake, watching over her. He reflected on the day, on the journey, and on the strange turn his life had taken. He had entered the village with one goal, to ensure her safety. But now he realized the experience had changed him too. He felt a weight in his chest, a mix of protectiveness, guilt, and curiosity. For the first time in years, he considered that life might have more to offer than survival and solitude. And as the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, casting a gentle glow on the cabin, the mountain man made a silent promise to himself. He would protect her, not as a possession, but as a human being. And perhaps in the process, he would learn what it meant to truly care, to truly connect, and to open the heart he had kept closed for so long. The morning air was crisp and sharp as it drifted through the small cabin. The first light of dawn revealed the soft golden glow on the wooden walls, and the faint smell of burning pine from the stove filled the room. The girl sat quietly at the edge of the table, her hands wrapped around a small cup of warm tea that the mountain man had prepared for her. She sipped slowly, watching the flames dance in the stove, lost in thought. The mountain man, standing near the window, observed her in silence. He had prepared breakfast, gathered firewood, and even tidied the cabin, but he found himself hesitant to speak. He didn't know what words to use or how to bridge the gap between their worlds. Finally, the girl broke the silence. "Why did you really take me?" she asked softly, her eyes not meeting his. The question was simple, almost innocent, yet it carried a weight that struck him harder than he expected. He froze, gripping the edge of the table as he considered his answer. He had thought he understood his own motives: protection, safety, responsibility. But her question forced him to confront something deeper. He looked out the window for a moment, his eyes tracing the path that led from the village to his cabin, the mountains beyond, and the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. I thought it was the right thing to do," he said slowly, his voice low and uneven. "You were alone. I didn't want you to be hurt." The girl shifted, finally turning her gaze to him. Her eyes were wide, and there was a flicker of understanding mixed with confusion. "But I'm not just something to protect," she said quietly. I have my own choices, my own thoughts. Did you even think about what I wanted?" The words hit him like a cold wind. He had not thought about that. He had acted instinctively, guided by his own rules, his own sense of morality. He had assumed that his idea of right and wrong was enough to decide for someone else. But her question was honest, direct, and challenging. It forced him to see himself clearly for the first time in decades. A man who had taken control without truly considering the human being he was trying to help. He sank into a chair, his hands resting on his knees. I didn't think about that," he admitted. The confession felt heavy, unfamiliar, and strangely relieving. For a long time, he had hidden behind his independence and strength, avoiding any acknowledgement of mistakes or weakness. Now, confronted with her words, he felt a vulnerability he had not felt in years. The girl watched him carefully, sensing his discomfort. "You don't have to be afraid to be honest with me," she said softly. I want to understand why." Her voice was gentle, patient, yet firm. It was the voice of someone who had endured hardship but had not lost the ability to question, to think, and to demand respect. He looked at her, studying the way she held herself, the way her eyes met his without fear. There was courage there, and it unsettled him. He realized that she was not fragile in the way he had imagined. Her body might be small and her circumstances difficult, but her spirit was strong. For the first time, he felt that he had underestimated her. "I thought I was helping," he said finally. "I wanted to keep you safe. I thought if I did this, you wouldn't be hurt by the world." His voice broke slightly, betraying the weight of emotion he usually kept buried. "But now, I see that I didn't consider you. I didn't think about what you wanted." The girl nodded slowly. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she looked around the cabin, taking in the simple wooden walls, the tools and supplies neatly arranged, the fire crackling in the stove. She seemed to be weighing her next words carefully, and he waited, tense and uncertain for what she might say. Finally, she asked another question, one that pierced him even deeper. "Do you see people as people or just as problems to fix?" The mountain man felt his heart tighten. He had never been asked a question like that before. His life had been about survival, rules, and self-reliance. People were rarely more than obstacles, annoyances, or, at best, companions who had to be handled carefully. To hear her ask this forced him to confront a truth he had long avoided, that in his attempt to survive, he had often failed to truly see others as human beings with their own desires, fears, and dignity. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. The cabin was silent except for the soft crackle of the fire. Outside, the mountain stood tall and silent, indifferent to human struggles, yet he felt their presence more keenly than ever. He had spent his life climbing, chopping, and surviving, yet none of that had prepared him for the vulnerability of facing another person's honest question. I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I did." I thought I could see people, understand them, but I see now that I've been blind." The girl studied him, her expression unreadable. She was not angry, nor was she frightened. She was curious, thoughtful, and unafraid. "Then maybe," she said quietly, "you should start seeing me as me, not as someone who needs to be saved." Her words sank into him. He realized that she was right. Every action he had taken, every decision he had made regarding her, had been guided by his own ideas, not hers. He had assumed he knew what was best, yet in doing so, he had denied her voice, her choice, and her humanity. It was a lesson that hurt, a truth that weighed heavily on him, but it was also a lesson he knew he had to learn. For the rest of the morning, they sat in the cabin, speaking in low, careful tones. The girl asked questions about his life, his cabin, and the mountains. He answered honestly, sharing stories of survival, loneliness, and mistakes. In return, she spoke of her own experiences, the hardships she had faced, and the small joys she had found in an otherwise difficult life. With every word, the mountain man felt his walls cracking, his rigid beliefs softening. He realized that this girl, so small and seemingly fragile, had the power to change him, simply by speaking the truth she had learned to hold on to. At one point, she asked about the villagers, about the people who had ignored her or taken advantage of her. His voice grew hard for a moment, filled with anger at the injustices she had faced. Yet, even in his anger, he saw that his role was not to punish the world, but to learn from it, and to act differently. Her question had shown him a mirror, reflecting his own flaws and blind spots. By midday, a fragile understanding had formed between them. The mountain man no longer saw her merely as someone he had bought or someone to protect. He saw her as a human being with her own thoughts, feelings, and dignity. The girl, in turn, saw that he was capable of reflection, capable of change, and though he was still rough around the edges, capable of care. Later, as they prepared a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and boiled eggs, the girl asked yet another question, quiet and tentative. "Do you ever wish that you could change?" The mountain man paused, cutting the bread slowly. He thought about his life, the decades of isolation, the mistakes, the missed chances for connection, and the hard lessons of survival. For the first time, he admitted to himself honestly that he did. He wished he could have lived differently, known more, felt more, and cared more openly. Her question had opened a door he had long kept closed, a door to his own emotions and regrets. "Yes," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I wish I could change. And maybe I can if I try." The girl nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. It was not a triumphant or joyful smile, but a quiet acknowledgement of understanding. She had asked the questions that no one else had dared to ask, questions that forced him to see himself as he truly was, not as he had believed himself to be. And in that moment, a silent bond formed between them, one built on honesty, reflection, and the fragile hope of something better. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, casting golden patterns on the floor, the mountain man felt something stir inside him that he had not felt in years. It was not fear, nor was it pride. It was a quiet, growing sense of responsibility, empathy, and awareness. He realized that this girl, in her courage and honesty, had already begun to teach him lessons he could not have learned alone. That evening, as they sat near the fire again, she asked quietly, "Will you let me make my own choices?" The mountain man looked at her, studying the determination in her eyes. For decades, he had ruled his life by his own rules, never considering the impact on others. Now, confronted with this simple, honest request, he felt a strange humility. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "You will make your own choices. I will respect that, and I will help you only if you ask me." A weight lifted from both of them in that moment. It was not a moment of triumph or resolution, but a beginning. They had crossed a threshold together, from fear, control, and misunderstanding to honesty, reflection, and respect. And though the path ahead was uncertain, Both of them knew that the foundation for trust had been laid, fragile yet real. As night fell over the mountains, the stars appearing like scattered diamonds in the sky, the mountain man sat quietly, watching the girl sleep peacefully near the fire. He reflected on the day, on the questions she had asked, and on the lessons he had learned. Her words had shaken him, opened him, and forced him to see the world and himself more clearly than he ever had before, and for the first time in decades he allowed himself to hope. He hoped that he could be better. He hoped that he could act rightly. And he hoped that, in protecting her, he could also learn to live with more honesty, compassion, and understanding. The girl's questions had done what no force of nature, no challenge, and no solitary year in the mountains had ever done. They had reached his heart and changed him forever. The days that followed were quiet but filled with small, meaningful moments that neither the mountain man nor the girl had expected. Life in the cabin, simple and unchanging in many ways, became something different, something alive, not because of the work or the solitude, but because of each other. The mountain man, who had spent decades surviving alone, now found himself adjusting to the presence of another human being. And the girl, who had known hardship and fear her entire life, began to experience a sense of safety and curiosity that she had never felt before. Morning routines, once solitary and methodical, became shared rituals. The mountain man would wake before dawn, chop wood for the fire, and fetch water from the nearby stream. The girl followed at first quietly, observing him, learning the rhythm of his life. At first, he had resisted giving her tasks, unsure of how to include her without seeming controlling. But slowly, he realized that part of her trust, and part of his own understanding, would come from treating her as capable, as someone who could act and make choices for herself. "You can carry some of the wood," he said one morning, nodding toward a small pile near the cabin. "It will make it easier for both of us." She hesitated for only a moment, then picked up the pieces, moving carefully but steadily. It was a simple act, yet it marked a small step in their evolving relationship. She was no longer just someone he needed to protect. She was someone who could help, contribute, and share the burdens of daily life. And for the mountain man, it was a revelation. He had never thought of cooperation, of shared responsibility in this way. Breakfast became a quiet ritual of its own. The mountain man would cook eggs and potatoes, sometimes adding herbs from the small garden he tended, while the girl helped set the table or fetch water. At first, conversation was minimal, filled with short sentences and careful observation. But gradually she began to speak more freely, asking about the mountains, the animals, and his life in the forest. He answered, sometimes gruffly, sometimes with a rare softness that surprised even him. "You live here all alone?" she asked one morning, her eyes wide as she stirred the tea in her cup. "All my life," he admitted. "Mostly." His voice carried a hint of regret, though he did not elaborate. She nodded thoughtfully, sensing the weight behind his words. "It must be lonely," she said softly. "Sometimes," he said, not hiding the truth, "but I've managed. The mountains, they have always been enough." She looked around, then at him, her expression serious. "Enough for you, maybe. But maybe not for everyone." Her words reminded him that his way of life, while strong and self-sufficient, was not the only way. They carried the subtle weight of someone who had endured much and learned to speak truth simply and clearly. The days passed with chores, walks through the forest, and quiet moments by the fire. But it was not the tasks that mattered. It was the growing awareness of each other's presence. The mountain man began to notice little things. The girl's careful steps on rocky paths, the way she paused to watch birds or insects, the gentle curiosity in her eyes. She noticed small things about him too, the lines in his hands, the way he paused to listen to the wind, the rare flicker of a smile when something amused him. One afternoon, they ventured farther into the forest, following a narrow trail that led to a hidden waterfall. The girl gasped at the sight of the water cascading over rocks, sunlight dancing on the mist. For a moment she laughed, a clear, melodic sound that filled the quiet air. The mountain man watched her, something inside him softening at the sound. He had not heard laughter like that in years, and it reminded him that life could contain moments of joy, even in hardship. "You've never seen anything like this?" she asked, turning to him. "Not like this," he admitted, his voice low, though there was a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "The forest is full of hidden places." She nodded, her eyes shining with wonder. "I'm glad you brought me here." The mountain man felt a strange warmth in his chest. He realized that she was no longer just someone he had taken responsibility for. She was someone he wanted to share experiences with, to teach and guide, and to protect out of genuine care rather than obligation. It was a new feeling, one he had never allowed himself to feel before. Evenings were quieter, spent by the fire, talking or sitting in companionable silence. The mountain man would sometimes tell stories of his youth, of the mountains, the storms he had survived, and the animals he had encountered. At first, she listened carefully, asking questions here and there. But gradually, she began to share her own stories, speaking of moments of fear, of small victories, and of dreams she had not dared to speak aloud until now. Her presence changed the rhythm of the cabin. It was no longer just a place of survival, but a space where two people could coexist, learn from each other, and grow. The mountain man found himself thinking about her even when he was alone, considering her needs, her comfort, and her perspective. And slowly he realized that this caring, this awareness, was opening parts of him that had long been shut off. One evening, as the fire crackled softly, the girl asked a question that surprised him. "Do you ever regret anything?" The mountain man paused, the flames reflecting in his eyes. "I regret not learning some things sooner," he said carefully. "Not understanding people, not seeing things clearly." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's never too late to start," she said gently. "Even small changes matter." Her words, simple and honest, sank deep into him. He realized that her insight, her courage, and her questions were not just shaping her experience, they were reshaping his life as well. He had thought of himself as a solitary survivor, untouched by others, but now he saw that connection, guidance, and even vulnerability could be strengths, not weaknesses. Over the following days, their bond continued to grow. They worked together to prepare food, mend clothing, and gather supplies from the forest. She learned to identify plants, track animals, and move quietly through the underbrush. He taught her how to use tools safely, how to prepare traps for small game, and how to respect the rhythms of the land. Every lesson was accompanied by small moments of laughter, gentle corrections, and shared discovery. It was not always easy. There were moments of frustration, missteps, and misunderstandings. The girl sometimes pushed boundaries, questioning his methods or offering suggestions he was not used to hearing. And he, accustomed to making decisions alone, sometimes struggled to accept her input. But each disagreement ended with discussion, reflection, and a mutual understanding that both voices mattered. Through these challenges, they learned to trust each other, respect each other, and appreciate the value of cooperation. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, the girl asked softly, "Do you think we can be different now?" The mountain man looked at her, his eyes reflecting the fading light. He thought about the days they had spent together, the lessons learned, the laughter, the shared work, and the growing understanding between them. He realized that she was right. They had both changed slowly, subtly, in ways that mattered. "Yes," he said quietly, "we can." The girl smiled faintly, a smile that carried both hope and relief. She understood that change was not instant, but it was possible, and that together they could face whatever challenges came next. For the mountain man, her smile was more powerful than any storm he had weathered, more meaningful than any victory over nature. It was a sign that connection, trust, and care were worth more than solitude and survival alone. As the night deepened and the stars sparkled above the mountains, they sat together by the fire, sharing stories, observing the flames, and enjoying the quiet companionship. The mountain man felt a sense of peace he had not known in decades, a peace born not of solitude, but of understanding, care, and respect. The girl, too, felt a growing sense of security and trust. She knew that the mountains could be harsh, but with him she could face them with courage and hope. By the time they prepared for sleep, a rhythm had formed, a rhythm of shared life, mutual respect, and quiet companionship. It was a far cry from the fear and uncertainty that had marked their first encounter, and both of them felt the difference keenly. The cabin, once a place of mere survival, had become a space for growth, trust, and the beginnings of a bond that neither had expected. And as the fire burned low and the mountains stood silently around them, the mountain man realized something profound. Life was not just about survival, strength, or independence. It was about understanding, connection, and the courage to change. The girl had arrived in his life unexpectedly, and in doing so had opened doors he did not know existed, doors to trust, empathy, and even redemption. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to imagine a future that included someone else, not as a burden, not as a possession, but as a companion, a partner in life's quiet moments, and a teacher of truths he had long ignored. The days ahead were uncertain and the challenges would be many, but he knew one thing for sure. They would face them together, with honesty, respect, and a growing sense of care. The days passed slowly but meaningfully, each one leaving a small mark on both the mountain man and the girl. Life in the cabin had settled into a rhythm built on trust, care, and shared experience. They worked together, laughed quietly at small mistakes, and shared stories that carried the weight of their pasts. The mountain man had grown softer, more aware of his words, his actions, and their consequences. For the first time in decades, he felt responsible not just for survival, but for nurturing, for guiding, and for seeing another person fully as a human being. The girl had changed too. She had learned the ways of the forest, how to carry herself confidently on rocky trails, and how to help with chores without being ordered. She was still cautious, still quiet at times, but she had begun to trust him, to see him as someone who could care without dominating. In turn, the mountain man had begun to trust her judgment, to listen to her suggestions, and to recognize that her thoughts and feelings were as important as his own. Their relationship, once defined by fear, necessity, and misunderstanding, had grown into something resembling respect, partnership, and even quiet affection. One morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the tall pine trees surrounding the cabin, the mountain man found himself watching her quietly. She was at the edge of the small garden, tending to the herbs and vegetables with careful hands. He noticed the patience in her movements, the way she focused on small details, and the gentle care she showed for the plants. It struck him that she had become part of this life, not as someone he controlled, but as someone who belonged naturally through her own choices and effort. "You've learned quickly," he said, his voice soft. "I didn't expect you to adapt so fast." She looked up, brushing soil from her hands. "I had a good teacher," she replied simply, a small smile tugging at her lips. He nodded, feeling warmth in his chest. It was a strange feeling, a mixture of pride, relief, and something deeper, something he had not felt in a long time. He realized that teaching her had taught him as much as it had taught her. He had learned patience, humility, and the power of guiding rather than controlling. As the day unfolded, they prepared food, tended to the cabin, and went on a short walk through the forest. The girl asked questions about the mountains, the animals, and even about his own past. Each question reminded him of how much he had lived in isolation, how many years he had missed out on connection, and how long he had hidden from his own emotions. But she did not judge him. She simply asked, listened, and observed. And in doing so, she helped him see himself more clearly than anyone else ever had. Later, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the girl sat on a rock near the stream, her reflection rippling in the water. She looked thoughtful, distant, yet peaceful. The mountain man approached, sitting beside her, careful not to break the quiet comfort that had formed between them. "You've changed me," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "I didn't know I could be different." She looked at him, her eyes wide and honest. "You always had it in you," she said softly. "You just didn't realize it. You've learned to see me, to hear me, and to care without taking away my freedom. That's the real strength." His chest tightened. He had spent so many years relying only on himself, believing that strength meant isolation, self-reliance, and survival at all costs. But her words reminded him that true strength also meant empathy, respect, and the courage to change. He realized that her presence had not just been a test, but a gift that had shown him a path to redemption. That evening, as they returned to the cabin and prepared a modest meal, the mountain man found himself thinking about the world beyond the mountains. For so long, he had avoided it, believing that life there would only bring trouble, disappointment, and weakness. But now, he wondered if he could face that world differently. If he could carry with him the lessons he had learned from the girl, respect, empathy, and openness, perhaps he could exist in it without losing himself. After supper, they sat by the fire, the flames dancing softly in the quiet cabin. The girl looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "I have to go back soon," she said gently. "I need to see what my life can be, and I need to make my own choices out there." The words struck him harder than any storm or hardship he had ever faced. He had grown accustomed to her presence, to the quiet companionship they shared, and the thought of letting her go filled him with a strange, heavy ache. But he also knew, deep down, that she was right. He could not keep her here out of fear or attachment. She had her own life, her own freedom, and her own path to follow. "You're right," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "You have to go. I can't stop you, and I wouldn't if I could. You deserve to live your life fully on your own terms." She reached out, touching his hand briefly. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything, for seeing me, for teaching me, for caring." He nodded, swallowing hard. "And thank you," he replied, "for reminding me how to see, how to care, and how to be better than I was." The night passed quietly, filled with reflection and preparation. The mountain man collected a few supplies, packed extra food for her journey, and helped her get ready. She moved with confidence now, a mixture of grace, caution, and strength. He could see that the girl who had arrived frightened and uncertain had grown into someone capable, resilient, and wise beyond her years. When the morning came, the mountains glowed with the soft light of dawn. The girl stood at the edge of the clearing, looking back at the cabin one last time. The mountain man stood beside her, his hands rough and calloused, his heart full of a strange mix of pride, sorrow, and hope. "You'll be all right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Use what you've learned, be brave, and remember, freedom and choice are yours to hold." She smiled, a bright, confident smile, and nodded. "I will, and I'll remember you too. You showed me how to trust, how to care, and how to see people clearly. I'll never forget that." With that, she turned and began her journey down the mountain trail. The mountain man watched her go, each step carrying her further into the world, further from his cabin, and further from the life he had known. And yet, as he watched, he realized that her departure did not bring emptiness. It brought hope. She was strong, capable, and free, and he had played a part in preparing her for the life she deserved. The mountains were silent once more, but this time the silence felt different. It was no longer just the stillness of isolation. It was a quiet affirmation of growth, understanding, and redemption. The mountain man stood at the edge of the clearing, feeling the wind on his face, and he allowed himself to smile. For the first time in decades, he understood the true meaning of connection, empathy, and moral strength. He had not just survived, he had learned, grown, and changed. Days later, life in the cabin returned to its rhythm, but the mountain man was no longer the same man who had lived alone for decades. He hunted, fished, and tended the land as before, but now he carried a new awareness in his heart. He understood the value of seeing others fully, of listening, of respect, and of trust. And in that awareness, he found a quiet peace that no storm or hardship could shake. The girl's journey continued far from the mountains, but the lessons she had learned stayed with her. She carried the knowledge that she was capable, that her voice mattered, and that kindness and trust could exist even in the harshest of circumstances. And somewhere in the mountains, the mountain man watched the sun rise and set, thinking of her, proud of her courage and grateful for the change she had inspired in him. The mountains, once silent witnesses to his solitude, now stood as witnesses to his growth. They had tested him, shaped him, and watched as he learned to see, to care, and to act with empathy. And in that quiet, enduring space, he found redemption, not in grand gestures, but in the simple act of letting another human being grow, live, and thrive freely. And so life continued in the mountains, forever changed by a small, quiet girl whose questions had shattered walls, opened hearts, and revealed the strength found in humility, empathy, and love. The mountain man had learned a truth more powerful than survival. True strength comes not from isolation, but from connection, understanding, and the courage to do what is right, even when it is difficult.